Hello, welcome everybody who's logging on. On behalf of everybody at the Center for Brain Health, welcome to the Frontiers of Brain Health. This is where we get to take a deep dive really into the most exciting developments in brain research. So we're so glad that you joined us today. My name is Dr. Lori Cook, and I serve as the Director of Clinical Research here at the Center for Brain Health, and am delighted to have the opportunity to welcome you today, as well as to welcome Dr. Judson Brewer, who you're in for a treat today. If you have not already heard him speak before, I'm delighted you've had the chance to join us today. Now, real quick, for those of you who don't know much about the Center for Brain Health, we are a cognitive neuroscience research center with the University of Texas at Dallas. And really, we've dedicated the past 3 decades to exploring neuroplasticity and really just the brain's amazing lifelong potential to get stronger and work better. So stay to the end, because we want to be sure that you also hear about one of our exciting, ongoing, groundbreaking research projects, our Brain Health Project. So stay tuned for that if you're not already in the know. So now, without further ado, I would love to take the opportunity to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Judson Brewer. Now, really quick, before I do, I want to let y'all know if anybody is going to have any questions, burning questions that come up while you're listening to him, you want to make sure that we ask him. We will have some time for Q&A at the end. So as those questions come up, we won't have a live chat going. Instead, please use the Q&A feature. So you'll see it at the bar at the bottom. You can enter your question there, and we'll take and ask as many as we are able, as we have time for at the end of the talk. So please be mindful of that. So just a quick introduction for Dr. Brewer. Now, some of you may have had the opportunity to actually hear him. Recently, he spoke for us as a part of our Citizen Science series earlier this month. He's doing a double feature for us. We are particularly thrilled to have him back to share, again, sort of a deeper dive into the research and what they're involved in. But Dr. Judson Brewer, he really is an internationally recognized thought leader in the fields, not just of habit change, but even this science of self-mastery. So he serves as the Director of Research and Innovation at Brown University's Mindfulness Center. And he's also an associate professor of psychiatry at Brown University's Medical School. Now, a lot of what he has done has involved developing mindfulness programs for behavior change, not just in person, but some really groundbreaking app-based treatments for aspects like smoking, emotional eating, and anxiety. But what I'm most thrilled about in particular is you can really see the intersection in his research between mindfulness, behavior change, as well as emotional regulation. So really covering the gamut and using multiple modes to evaluate that and really generate meaningful solutions. So it's designing, testing, implementing some digital therapeutics to get these tools out in the real world, or sharing information about research in a really relatable way. He's, for example, been the author of 2 books, The Craving Mind, and then most recently, in fact, hot off the presses this month, Unwinding Anxiety, which I think he'll speak largely about today. I encourage you all to check out his work. I think the themes that I've really been struck by in his case are aspects of curiosity, relatability, and encouragement, really helping us all feel more confident in being the drivers of our own brain health and creating better well-being for ourselves and others. So with that, please allow me to pass the torch to Dr. Brewer. Thank you so much for being here. Take it away.
Thanks for having me, and it's a real joy to be here with you all today. I will jump right in just to get the details out of the way. So I've got my lab works with this company that develops these apps. All of this is managed by Brown. And then also, as was mentioned, I had a book that just came out called Unwinding Anxiety, just I think 2 weeks ago. And so I'll be speaking to a lot of the themes that I cover in the book. I thought we could just jump right in, talk about a patient that really exemplifies not just anxiety, but the overlap between it and comorbid disorders. I had a patient that was referred to me for anxiety. Turns out he had full-blown panic disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. And his panic was related to driving on the highway, where he would have a thought that he was going to get in a car accident. He started avoiding driving on the highway. And then that reward for him was, from his brain perspective, he was learning, oh, if I don't drive on the highway, I won't have panic attacks. I won't have these distressing thoughts. Yeah, he was very anxious by the time he even came to my office driving only on local roads. So these types of avoidance strategies that our brain comes up with only help us so much. So we'll talk today about how these get set up, and we'll also talk about how to work with them. The other thing that was pretty noticeable about my patient when he just walked in the door was that he was very overweight. He was about 180 pounds overweight. So the one question we can start asking ourselves is, how do we work with this? And I use this cartoon, have you tried worrying about it? I start worrying about my own patients in my own clinic with their anxiety, because gold standard medications their number needed to treat is 5.15, meaning I need to treat 5 patients before one of them shows a significant benefit. So the treatments that are out there that are gold standard, I'm playing the medication lottery, not knowing which patient to help. Well, how about with obesity? Here's a graph from 85 to 2015 showing that despite knowing that calories in versus calories out is the way to treat obesity, it's not working. We're going the opposite direction. So why is it that if we know how these things, can be treated, making sure that we don't eat as many calories as we exercise off, why can't we actually work with these? And here I turn to this phrase that was attributed to Einstein: no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And what this is pointing out is that we're actually using a part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, this thinking and planning and willpower part of our brain, to try to force our way through situations. Yet we're seeing clearly that this doesn't work. And what I would suggest is that we don't actually know how our brains work. Or let me rephrase that. What I would suggest is there might be some overlooked elements of how our brains work that we haven't been paying attention to enough. For example, just to have a very simplified view, just in the interest of time, that we know that we've got this survival brain, and it helps us, remember where food is. It helps us avoid danger. And then we also have a newer part of the brain that helps us survive in a different way, which is through thinking and planning. In fact, focusing in on this old brain, very famous researcher, B.F. Skinner, he was really interested in why animals behave the way that they do. I love this video from his archives. This is where he could show that he could train a pigeon to win a cross-court shot in ping pong for a food reward. Now, pigeons aren't particularly prone to playing ping pong, yet they will play for food. And what he was highlighting, there's the instant replay. What he was highlighting was this process that is very, very well known. It was described even back in the 1800s by Edward Thorndike, called positive and negative reinforcement. Now, as a clinician, as a psychiatrist, this is very helpful to know, because I can start to look for these mechanistic underpinnings in my patients as they come to my office. And then we can start to ideally help them with these things. So, for example, my patient who was referred to me for anxiety, we started looking into, all of these mechanisms, and I'll talk about this in a minute, of what we found with him. But just to give a more broad example, for my patients who are trying to stop drinking, there's this phrase: people, places, and things. If you avoid these cues, you're less likely to drink. So we can see how that fits mechanistically. If somebody's trying to quit smoking, it's hard to avoid all the places that they smoke. So we bring in substitution behaviors, such as eating for smoking. So we eat candy instead of smoking a cigarette. Yet neither of these actually dismantle the loop at its core. And just to bring this into its essential elements, it's really only 3 elements that are needed to form this positive or negative reinforcement: a trigger, a behavior, and a result or a reward from a brain standpoint. And I use hunger as an example because this is really what our brain has evolved to help us survive. Remember where food is and avoid danger. Yet knowing this process, this can be used. And we see this in modern day. For example, food is engineered to be addictive. We see social media being engineered for the likes and the retweets to basically make people like pigeons where they're pecking for food. You're pressing a lever, you're scrolling for some type of a reward. So what I would suggest is that there's actually a whole lot known. If you just look at social media and how addictive it is, there's a whole lot known about the brain, and it's already being used in modern day in different ways, whether it's food or for getting people to pay attention in an attention economy. So how can we actually take this information and capitalize on it to help people break bad habits and even form good habits? Well, here's where my lab's been studying for the last couple of decades, ways to bring simple but not easy practices in, such as mindfulness, to start to address these issues. I'm sure, if not all of you, most of you are familiar with mindfulness. For example, mindfulness-based stress reduction was developed in the 1970s by Jon Kabat-Zinn. It's probably the most studied mindfulness-based program in the world. He talks about mindfulness as being paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. From a mechanistic standpoint, I think of this as bringing this wedge of awareness in instead of avoiding or substituting things, so that wedge can help us respond with awareness rather than habitually react, than just getting stuck in our old habit loops. Just as an example, I had a patient who came to me who'd been smoking for 40 years, and we just mapped out, what was the trigger, what was the behavior. The behavior was smoking, and then what was the result of that? In fact, he'd been smoking 40 years. We calculated the number of times he had reinforced this process. It was about 293,000. So he'd done this quite a bit. And as we started to map this out, he had no idea that his mind worked in this simple way. He'd get stressed, he'd smoke a cigarette, he would feel a little bit better, or he'd get a nicotine deficit. And so he'd get that physiologic craving, and then he would smoke, and then he would get this relief. So even just starting to see the process is very helpful. Now, can seeing actually help us change behavior? This seems really far-fetched, let's say. So how does paying attention actually work? Well, here I bring forward somebody, we have people pay attention as they smoke cigarettes. And here's what one person reported: smells like stinky cheese and tastes like chemicals. And the idea here is to really tap into this really strong reward-based learning system, which is based on rewards. It's not based on the behavior itself. If it were based on the behavior, I could just tell my patients to quit smoking, stop smoking, stop overeating, stop worrying, and they would stop. It could be, a one visit clinic where I would see a new patient, they would be cured, and then I would see the next patient, and eventually we can cure everyone with one visit. That's not how it works. Our brains work based on how rewarding a behavior is. So we have to start there. If we can help people see through simple awareness that a behavior is not very rewarding, they start to become disenchanted, and they start to change that behavior. Or as Yogi Berra put it, you can observe a lot just by watching. I'm going to blow through this because we published these data, 10 years ago now. In our first study, we got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment using mindfulness. So, and we can look at the mechanism. I won't go into it in the interest of time because I want to focus on anxiety today. But suffice it to say, it does look like mindfulness can help decouple the urge and the action. And in fact, when we were developing these mindfulness training programs, I started to realize that, people don't learn to smoke in my office. And yet this reward-based learning system is set up to help people learn things in a context. They learn to remember where food is. So we thought, well, maybe we could actually take my office, package it up, and deliver it to them. So I could look out my office. I was working at the VA hospital at the time. We were on a smoke-free campus, so my patients would be out smoking in the parking lot. They're out with the cigarette in one hand, and guess what they had, in their other? Their weapons of mass distraction. So we started thinking, well, maybe we can deliver these things, deliver an evidence-based treatment through an app. So we developed one called Craving and Quit for smoking, one for eating, overeating, and stress eating and emotional eating called Eat Right Now, and then even one for anxiety. Now you might think, Well, and I should say, and all of these are based on this core mechanistic underpinning of reward-based learning or reinforcement learning. So you might think, how is anxiety actually a habit? Well, in fact, there's quite a bit of research going back to the 80s showing that anxiety itself can trigger worry thinking as a behavior, which makes us feel like we're in control because or at least that we're doing something, but the literature suggests it's a feeling of control. Yet when we realize we're not really that much in control, that reward drops, and then we realize that worry actually feels pretty bad and it makes us more anxious. And so the anxiety feeds back, or the worry feeds back and drives more anxiety. So how can we actually develop treatments that can be delivered in context, at scale, at low cost? Well, these evidence-based trainings, we can package them, we can cut them into bite-sized pieces where we give people gradual trainings where it's something like, 10 minutes a day, where people say, well, I can't do this for an hour. Well, you can do this for 10 minutes. We can give them animations. I don't have time to show you one, but you can take a look at the apps and you'll see how they work. The idea is to really engage people in a simple way, but not oversimplifying things, to help them learn how their minds work. We can give them in the moment exercises so that when they're anxious or when they're craving food or a cigarette, they can work with it. And importantly, as a scientist, I want to see if this stuff actually works. So we can embed things like experience sampling and we can test these things. The other thing that we can do is we can pair these with online communities so that people can get peer support, and we can also moderate things. We can have experts moderate these communities at scale. And we find that, community, this has been shown in a lot of research, that peer support and community engagement is really critical for helping people with any type of behavior change. So I just want to shift briefly to this Eat Right Now app, where we started developing this based on somebody using the Craving and Quit app saying, I'm starting to change my eating behavior. And they said, in fact, that they were starting to snack less using some of these mindfulness training programs. So we said, can we develop this for eating? So I started pilot testing this in my clinic. And I had a patient with binge eating disorder, for example. So the far end of the spectrum of habitual eating, where she described that for about 20 years, she would eat as a way to assuage her negative emotions. And in fact, when she came to see me, she was about 30 years of age. She was indulging, or I shouldn't say indulging. She was binging on large pizzas 20 out of 30 days a month. So entire large pizza, one sitting, 20 out of 30 days a month. And when we looked at it, it was really as a way to help protect her from some emotional trauma that she had been enduring. So long story short, the way that this works mechanistically is with these negative emotions. If somebody binge eats, they get this brief relief, or as this patient put it, she could numb herself from these negative emotions. So she didn't actually know how her mind worked. So we can actually start to target that, help her understand how her minds work, and then help her work with her mind. First study with this was led by Ashley Mason at UCSF. This was published a couple of years ago, where the outcome was just to look to see mechanistically if she could target the same thing that we were targeting with smoking. And in fact, we saw pretty strong results in this respect. 40% reduction in craving-related eating. This was measured by experience sampling, and then a 35% reduction in eating to cope with negative emotions. So that was promising. Mechanistically, it looked like it was lining up pretty nicely with the Craving and Quit app. Well, what about anxiety? And so as I struggled to help my own patients with anxiety, turns out that somebody pilot testing our Eat Right Now app said, I realized that my habit loop is where I get anxious and then I eat. Can you make a program for anxiety? And I was thinking, well, I prescribe medications, but it put a bug in my ear, made me start looking back at the literature. And then I realized, maybe anxiety can be driven in a similar manner. So we started doing what I do is as a clinician, I'll develop a program, and then as a researcher, I'll study it. So we did our first study of the Unwinding Anxiety app with anxious physicians, because we wanted to work with a challenging population in the sense that they tend to always put other people first. So we needed to find something that we could package into bite-sized pieces that could be, that they'd actually follow. Long story short, this was a small open label trial. So single arm of 34 individuals, we got a 57% reduction in anxiety. These are clinically validated anxiety scores, the GAD-7 at 3 months. So that was promising. We saw a signal there, but we needed to make sure that this was actually solid. So we did a follow-up study. This is funded by the NIH, where we did a randomized controlled trial in people with generalized anxiety disorder, the Olympians of worrying. And we found actually, I should update this slide. It's actually a 67% reduction in anxiety at 2 months. And you can see the huge separation between them and the control group. The control group got clinical care. They were continuing their treatment in the clinic. They got about a 14% reduction. So some help with their medication or whatever they were doing, but a lot of help if you added in some mindfulness training. And here you can see that the number needed to treat was 1.6. So as I mentioned at the beginning, medications, it's 5.15. Here, we only needed to treat about 1.6 people to see a very significant reduction. And you can see here that below 5 is minimal anxiety. So folks are going from moderate, cutoff for in the GAD-7 for moderate, it's 10, 15 is severe. So this is moderate to severe anxiety, and they're dropping back below the cutoff for minimal anxiety. So that was encouraging. And in fact, we could look mechanistically to see what was happening. So we could measure worry. You can see a significant reduction in worry. We could measure interoceptive awareness. You can see a significant and specific increase in awareness. We can measure non-reactivity as part of mindfulness. So this is the subscale of the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire. You can see an increase that's specific to the mindfulness group here in emotional non-reactivity. And then we can take all of these and we can do mediation analyses to see what's actually driving the effect. And here we found that an increase in non-reactivity specifically mediated a reduction in worry, and that reduction in worry specifically mediated a reduction in anxiety. And I say specifically because this was specific to the mindfulness training group. So we can see very strong effects. We can see these clinically, we can see these in these mediators, and we can see how these mediators actually mediate clinically relevant outcomes like GAD-7 scores. So those were 2 positive studies, pretty strong results. So we wanted to, of course, as a researcher, I wanted to see what else we can do. So here we started looking to see, can anxiety and sleep actually, there's good literature showing that anxiety actually makes people have trouble sleeping. I see this all the time in my clinic, where my patients, their head hits the pillow and then their brain says, my turn, and they start worrying about what's going to happen, or they regret things that they did during the day. And it makes it really difficult for them to sleep. Then they look at the clock and they realize, oh man, I'm not getting to sleep. And they get more anxious that they're not sleeping. So there's such a strong literature here that the NIH created these promise measures, which are these standardized measures where they have a number of questions specifically linking anxiety and sleep. So we asked this question, well, can we, in a randomized controlled trial, can we actually help people who struggle with the problem where worry interferes with sleep? These are hot off the press. We just broke blind on this study. What we found here was very similar to our previous study. We got a 40% reduction in anxiety at 2 months in our active group, and you can see the difference here. Yet at 4 months, you can see that there's no difference between our treatment as usual and our mindfulness group. Well, what's going on here? Well, it's because we did a study where we could give our treatment as usual group the active ingredient at 2 months to see if we could replicate our results. So we can basically do a replication within a study. And you can see here that the mindfulness training group maintained their gains, and the control group went from, again, moderate to severe anxiety to a significant reduction, 46% reduction. This is the active group. So around, I don't know the exact numbers here because we're still looking at the data, but a pretty significant reduction that's now no different from our active group. So here we're seeing this replicated. So that's anxiety. What about sleep? Well, when you look at, before I do that, these are just our GE models. So you can look at the prediction. At 2 months, we see a significant prediction of reduction in anxiety scores. These are the absolute values. So you can see from 12 down to 8. You can see that they maintain their gains in the active group from 2 to 4 months. The control group stays about the same, and then they drop down to the same level as the active group. So pretty striking findings. What about sleep? So here we looked at this PROMIS composite. I think this was 5 sleep PROMIS measures related to worry. Here we see a 24% reduction in anxiety interfering with sleep at 1 month, and at 33% reduction at 2 months. And here you can see Once we give the control group the active ingredient, they drop, they stay about the same as baseline, and then they drop significantly once they get active ingredient. So we can see here, there's a replication of this finding. So we're really excited about this. If you look at the GE models, you can see the same thing, significant prediction and reduction. In the active group, they maintain their gains at 4 months. No real change here from 2 to 4 months in the control group, but once they get active ingredient, they basically replicate the effect in our mindfulness group. So just, the last thing I'll mention here is we can also start to bring this forward and personalize treatment. So this is something I'm also very, very excited about. So this was based on research. So one of my postdocs went to a computational psychiatry conference where we could look at, voxylation and see if you could predict treatment outcomes based on fMRI. Well, then I asked this question, well, why can't we just voxylate our questionnaire? So can we break all of our questionnaires into single items, and can we use that as a way to determine, in a machine learning based process, can we actually determine clusters, and can those clusters predict outcomes? Long story short, yes, we can. So this was in the first study with individuals with generalized anxiety disorder. If we take these 4 questionnaires, so we get about 62 questions total, with as few as 62 questions, which can be delivered in 10 minutes or less, we can actually get 3 significant clusters. So cluster 1 here, and they're about equal, which is pretty interesting. Cluster 1 here, I think of them as, are you worried and you know it? If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're worried and you know it, clap your hands, because you're going to have the biggest treatment effect here. So you can see these folks are high on the Penn State Worry Questionnaire, also high in the GAD-7 relative to the other groups. They're also higher on the interoceptive awareness. So this is, if you're worried and you know it, clap your hands, because you can see the F value here is huge. These folks showed the biggest reduction in GAD-7 scores at the end of treatment. Group 3 here was in between group 1 and 2, so they had a significant effect. It wasn't as strong as 1, yet these folks also started out with moderate levels of anxiety. And cluster 2 was the most, let's say, treatment resistant. So these folks, and we're trying to categorize what it is, they struggled with this. So this gives us a snapshot at baseline. We can take 10 minutes, ask people questions, and see if this can actually sort people into different clusters, where we can know right at baseline who's more likely to benefit from a mindfulness treatment, who might need extra help, or who might need a different type of treatment. So we need to do a lot more work here, but we've literally just been analyzing these data, and we're really excited about where this can go. So, just to summarize this part of the talk, I think, we know a whole lot about how the mind works. If you just look at reinforcement learning, and just using the examples of smoking and eating and anxiety, it looks like if we can take that mechanistic understanding, we can actually deliver, targeted treatments that are evident and develop a strong evidence base for them. What I'd like to do now, just in the interest of time, is jump into what the process actually looks like. So I'm going to go through this quickly, but it's basically a 3-step process. And this is why I wrote the Unwinding Anxiety book, is to really highlight these 3 steps in detail. The first step is becoming caught up or aware of being caught up in the habit loop. I'll talk about this in a minute. Second step is exploring the results. This is really important. And then the third step is helping us step out of these habit loops using what I call the bigger, better offer, finding something that's more rewarding for our brains. So what does it mean? What do I mean by recognizing a habit loop? Here's somebody who is in our Eat Right Now program who wrote in her online journal, I understand why I go to food: to avoid or to cover up or distract from uncomfortable feelings such as anger, sadness, or restlessness. Who wants to feel those things? Trigger: uncomfortable feeling. Behavior: eat something that temporarily diminishes the feeling. Reward: still have to deal with the unpleasant feelings plus the sugar headache. I can clearly see how I got caught in this habit loop trying to escape difficult feelings with food, but that ultimately it doesn't work, right? So not only is this person able to see how her mind works, but she's able to start becoming disenchanted with the process, which is what step 2 is all about. I think of this as the beginning of the end. And this really involves a critical part of the brain called the orbitofrontal cortex, which basically determines and stores reward value. We've got this whole reward value hierarchy in our brain. I'm just using chocolate and broccoli as an example. I'll use my own personal example. For me, my brain says, milk chocolate tastes better than broccoli. I'd rather eat that when given a choice. If I eat dark chocolate, my brain's going to compare those. And of course, the dark chocolate for me is more rewarding. So my reward hierarchy goes broccoli, milk chocolate, dark chocolate. And the orbitofrontal cortex is actually critical for determining this. And in fact, this is such a well-known process. This was described back in the 70s by Rescorla and Wagner. You can mathematically model this. Basically, don't worry too much about the math, but basically a reward value is going to be based on the previous reward value plus an error term. And that error term is focused on this prediction error. So if we eat something and we don't pay attention, then we're just going to keep that same reward value. So that error term, there's no prediction error. If we eat something and we pay attention, it tastes better than it was, we get a positive prediction error where our brain says, ooh, that's better than I remembered. And our brain updates that reward value. If we eat something and it tastes worse, our brain says, ooh, wow, I'm not going to eat there again. And our brain gets this negative prediction error. And the key to all of this, the key to changing behavior is awareness. Awareness helps us bring in these prediction errors. So if something stays the same, we're not going to change it. If something is more rewarding, we're going to do it more. And if something is less rewarding, we're going to do it less. This is where we can bring this in with eating and smoking. So we can actually embed a way to measure this in our apps. And right now, if we even do this with the Craving Quit app, and we can calculate the Rescorla-Wagner models to see how rewarding something is and if that reward changes over time. Here's our first study. This is with 38 individuals. And you can see that the reward value drops below zero, below the reward of not eating. This is with overeating. It drops below zero after about 10 to 15 times. And you can see that their action selection probability. So they're going to start picking the behavior of not eating because it is more rewarding as compared to eating. First study, relatively small. We replicated this with a community sample of 1,000 folks. You can see that the error bars shrink here with all the large data set. And you can see basically the same result. So that was pretty promising. And I love, to hear what people are actually saying. This person said, dear sneaky habit loop that says eating junk food is fun. I'm on to you, right? It's not rewarding anymore. What about smoking? We see similar trends here. You can see it's a little messier. And it also, interestingly, doesn't drop to zero here, probably because they've reinforced these habits so many times as compared to eating. Yet the action selection probability does change as people start to realize the smoking isn't very good. Or as this person put it, today, all the cigarettes I smoked were disgusting. So now what can we do? Well, this is where we can, if our brain is starting to see that something is not rewarding, we can give it something more rewarding and call this the BBO, the bigger, better offer. And if you think about this from a reinforcement learning standpoint, what are our old behaviors? They tend to be things like eating, worrying, smoking, going on social media or whatever. These only give us temporary relief from whatever it is. I'm just using negative emotions as an example. Yet, can we find something that we can substitute that gives us more than brief relief? And here I love Lewis Carroll's quote from Alice in Wonderland, curiouser and curiouser, because this really highlights the essence of mindfulness, which is about curiosity. So can we actually substitute curiosity? And because it's internal, it's intrinsically motivating, we can always tap into it. We can get this sustained relief. We can always become curious about something as compared to becoming habituated to looking at cute pictures of puppies on Instagram or whatever it is that we turn to as a distraction. I'll give you an example. This was somebody in our Unwinding Anxiety program who said, when I first started the program, I didn't quite buy into the benefits of curiosity. Today, I felt a wave of panic, and instead of immediate dread or fear, my automatic response was, that's interesting. That took the wind right out of its sails. I wasn't just saying it was interesting. I actually felt it. So just to bring all of this to a close, and we just published a paper on this, what I would suggest is that triggers are ubiquitous. There's nothing we can do about these. Instead of trying to avoid triggers, what we can do is we can work with them. What we tend to do is we fall into our automatic habit loop. So see cake, eat cake, and then, don't feel that great, or we overeat or whatever. But yet this just keeps getting reinforced, and we feel like we've got no choice in the process because it's automatic. Well, what about diet mentality? Well, let me just force myself not to eat the cake. So that behavior feels depleting. If you believe in ego depletion, if you believe that research, let's just say for sake of argument that that's true. It helps us. It's aligned with goals. So we don't eat, yet it doesn't feel very good. It's depleting. It feels constricted. Well, what if there's an alternative path? And that's what these data suggest, is that we can actually bring the behavior of being curious. Oh, what's that craving to eat the cake feel like? And that curiosity helps us see, oh, I don't just have to force myself not to eat, or I don't have to just succumb to this craving. That curiosity itself is enlivening. It gives us energy. So you can read our, this was published in PPS just a few months ago. So if you want the details on that, you can read about that. So, just to summarize all of this, I would suggest we do know a whole lot about habits and I would say even everyday addictions. And what this suggests is that we can substitute simple things like curious awareness to help us start to step out of the process. Now, I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes and talk about some of the neuroscience behind this. So I think a framework for this that I find helpful is this feeling of getting caught up. So for example, daydreaming. There was some studies showing that we get caught up in daydreaming about 50% of waking life. When we get caught up in daydreaming, we can snap out of it. When we get caught up in stress, it's a little harder to snap out of it. In fact, if somebody says, hey, just relax, stop worrying, we might even get more caught up. We might get more stressed. And if you look at addiction, that far end of the spectrum, continued use despite adverse consequences. That's a simple definition that I learned in residency. That's fabulous. We might be so caught up that we're not even aware, or we don't feel like we have any control and we can't get out of it. Now, this caught up feeling is something that we all experience. And in fact, there was this great study published about 5-6 years ago where they induced a bunch of emotions in people and asked them where they felt them. And they developed these heat maps where people could say, oh yeah, I feel this here. So for example, with fear and anxiety, we see the people report the most that they feel fear and anxiety in their chest region, which makes a lot of sense. We close down when we're in danger. And the idea is probably from an evolutionary perspective is to protect our vital organs, to make sure we don't get, we don't get gored by the saber-toothed tiger or whatever it is that's chasing us. So if this feeling of caught up is experienced so much, for example, even with daydreaming, and we all know what this feels like to feel this contracted feeling, we can actually map this out in the brain. So there's a lot of work that's done in the default mode network. I'm sure you all are familiar with this. This has been discovered about 20 years ago by Marcus Rakel and his group at Washington University in St. Louis. This default mode network gets activated with a whole bunch of things. I'm going to focus in today on these two main hubs of the default mode network, the posterior cingulate and the medial prefrontal cortex. For example, in a study published a couple of years ago, adolescents that were viewing their own Instagram images, the only manipulation that was made here was that they arbitrarily gave some of the pictures more likes than others, and they could look at the contrast. They found that the nucleus accumbens, so these reward centers, were activated, but they were also activating the main hub of this default mode network, the posterior cingulate. So there's something even rewarding about self and about getting caught up in this experience. That's one example. Hugh Garvan and his group showed this 20 years ago now, that when people were addicted to cocaine or shown pictures of people smoking crack cocaine, their default mode network gets activated. Amy Janes at Harvard showed this with people who smoke. This posterior cingulate lights up like a Christmas tree when people who are addicted to nicotine are shown pictures of people smoking. The same true with pathological gambling. When people are shown, people with pathological gambling are shown scenes of people gambling, their posterior cingulate gets activated. And this is interesting because this also gets activated when people worry. So you can see these two main hubs of the default mode network shown here in orange. This is the correlation between worry and activation. So the more people worry, the more their posterior cingulate, the more their default mode network gets activated. So when we get caught up in worrying, this also seems to be the case. And in fact, we were thinking about this years ago, is the posterior cingulate actually a marker of people experientially getting caught up in what's happening? And we could test this, and I'm going to go through this quickly because we published this a while ago, and I think I've actually I've presented some of these data at this forum before. Mindfulness is about helping us get out of our own way, so it can be a nice independent variable as a way to test these brain mechanisms. Think of this as not getting caught up in ourselves. So again, a study we published 10 years ago, experienced versus novice meditators. We find that experienced meditators across 3 different types of meditation practice are showing a decrease in default mode network activity relative to novices. So blue here is decreases, less activity. So that was interesting, but this was a cross-sectional study. So we wanted to see, prospectively, does this mean anything? So this is in collaboration with Amy Janes at Harvard with her smoking paradigm. What we did was we brought people into the scanner who you can see smoking cues, you can see neutral cues. We scanned their brains at baseline to see how active their default mode network got. Then we could randomize them to get app-based mindfulness training or the National Cancer Institute's app. We could scan them a month later and see if changes in brain activity predicted clinical outcomes. Here we found a strong correlation between reduction in posterior cingulate activity and a reduction in cigarette smoking. Yet this correlation was specific to mindfulness training. You can see the National Cancer Institute group did not show a correlation at all. In fact, we found a dose-dependent relationship. The more modules they completed, the better they did. No correlation in the control group. And in fact, we could account for 58% of the variance with 3 variables: PCC activity, number of modules, and number of cigarettes smoked at baseline, which probably means they have farther to go. So that was pretty great to see. It's the holy trinity of science, where you've got theory that lines up with brain mechanism, that lines up with clinical outcomes. So that was pretty exciting to see. So we rewind a little bit. We wanted to see what exactly was happening in the posterior cingulates when people were meditating, or when people, what exactly was lining up with posterior cingulate activity. So we could start to use techniques. This is 8 years ago now. We could use techniques where we could give people real-time feedback from their own brains to see how well their activity correlated with their subjective experience. I'm not going to go into the details now because we published a couple of papers on this now. There's a paper led by Katie Garrison, who's now an assistant professor at Yale, fabulous researcher, where we did a neurophenomenologic study where we could link up people's brain activity with their subjective experience in real time. You can read about that. I think it's in Frontiers if you want to know the details. But just to kind of give you an idea of what this looks like, we brought Anderson Cooper in as part of a 60 Minutes piece that he was doing on meditation, hooked him up and gave him feedback from his posterior cingulate in real time. And here's what happened.
This is just the next generation of exercise. We've got the physical, exercise components down, and now it's about working out how can we actually train our minds.
Dr. Brewer is trying to understand how mindfulness can alter the functioning of the brain. He uses a cap lined with 128 electrodes.
We're going to start filling each of these 128 wells with conduction gel.
The electrodes are able to pick up signals from the posterior cingulate, part of a brain network linked to memory and emotion.
This is all just picking up electrical signal from the top of your head.
Since attending the mindfulness retreat, I'd been meditating daily and was curious to see if it had an impact on my brain.
We're going to have you start with thinking of something that was very anxiety-provoking for you.
Okay. When I thought about something stressful, the cells in my brain's posterior cingulate immediately started firing, shown by the red lines that went off the chart on the computer screen.
Just drop into meditation.
Okay. When I let go of those stressful thoughts and refocused on my breath, within seconds the brain cells that had been firing quieted down, shown by the blue lines on the computer.
That's really fascinating to see like that.
Dr. Brewer believes everyone can train their brains to reach that blue mindfulness zone, but he says all the technology we're surrounded by makes it difficult.
So just to bring this to a close, you can see how we can start to line up behavioral mechanisms with brain mechanisms, and these can start to inform each other. So just to wrap it up, how do my patients do? Obviously, if they didn't do it well, I wouldn't be telling you about them. So my patient with binge eating disorder, who'd been binging on entire large pizzas 20 out of 30 days a month, she basically quit binging. She lost a bunch of weight. But what she said to me that was most meaningful was she said, I feel like I have my life back. I can actually eat a single piece of pizza and enjoy it. So it's not about avoiding the objects. It's about changing our relationship to them. How did my patient with anxiety do in obesity? Well, when long story short, I sent him home with the Unwinding Anxiety app, had him start mapping out his habit loops. And he came back 2 weeks later, he'd lost 14 pounds. And he basically said, well, I realized that I was eating because I was anxious and it wasn't helping. So he stopped doing it. He went on to lose over 100 pounds. And I was about 6 months into treatment. I was walking out of our School of Public Health after teaching a class. It's on South Main Street. It's a pretty busy street. I was walking along the sidewalk. This car pulls up. Guy rolls down his window. It's my patient. And he goes, oh, hey, Dr. Judd. And I was looking at him thinking, oh, you're driving. And he goes, yeah, I'm an Uber driver now. I'm on my way to the airport to pick somebody up. So I just thought that was a nice example of how we can really learn how our minds work, and we can learn to work with our minds. I'll just finish. I love this quote from Rumi's poem, A Community of Spirit. He says, be empty of worrying. Think of who created thought. Why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open? Move outside the tangle of fear thinking. Live in silence. Flow down and down in always widening rings of being. So I will stop there, and I would like to give my profound gratitude to all the folks that contributed to this work, as well as our funders. Most of this work was funded by the NIH. And then also, if you have if you want to find more resources, we've got some free courses for clinicians, both at my website, drjudd.com, as well as the Mindfulness Center has a bunch of resources as well as teacher training programs. And if nothing else, just remember Merritt Oliver's instructions for life: pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. So I will stop there, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Brewer, for that talk, taking us through so much valuable information. And I know we've had a lot of great questions come in. So I'm going to do my best to address the ones that we can. I think in particular, myself included, so many of us were so encouraged to see those hot off the press results about the study, looking at, especially those who feel that interference from the anxiety to their sleep. I think we've got some great questions there. Some folks were curious, because I know you used the term sort of the active ingredients, right, for the active group. Can you clarify what were the active ingredients in that trial in particular?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I didn't. And I'm still learning how to talk about the trial, because this is literally the first time I've ever presented those data. So that's how hot off the press they are. Active ingredient basically meant, so we had this treatment as usual, basically a weightless control. So we could measure the effects that were specific to mindfulness. At 2 months, we actually gave the control group the mindfulness training program. So they could basically, it would be a follow-on replication, so to speak, of the first 2 months with the active ingredients. So basically we had 2 cohorts that got treatment just at a different time. First group got it at, from 0 to 2 months, and then they continued with it. So you could see their gains and then maintain. And then the second group got treatment at 2 months. Think of it as a longer baseline period. And at 4 months, we could measure the results, and they basically replicated what we saw at 2 months with the first group, because it was a 2-month treatment period. Hopefully that's helpful.
Excellent. Absolutely. Well, and I think another question that came out of it, interestingly, because others had already asked, what might be some characteristics of folks that are, particularly predictive, maybe of people who can respond well to the mindfulness training. And I love that you shared the cluster data and sort of exploring that. Can you recap for folks some of the clusters that you're seeing so far, or maybe even discussion even beyond those aspects of characteristics that could potentially be predictive?
Yes, I wish I could discuss more, but we literally don't know. We're setting up qualitative interview studies right now, and I think we just got IRB approval for it. So we're going to follow up on this. Oh, and I should also say we did a large population-based study, 14,000 people that replicated that. I should have put that slide in there, but it's so new that I'm still putting those slides together. So we can see this in the general population, and the general characteristics, I would say, with the folks that are most responsive to treatment, this is all I can say yet until we get the qualitative interview data, is that these are folks that are higher in anxiety. So they start out higher in anxiety than the others. This is relative, though. This is still everybody. The cutoff for inclusion in the study was 10, greater than 10 on the GAD-7. So still at least moderate to severe anxiety. These had the most anxiety, and they knew it, right? So their interoceptive awareness they scored highly on the multidimensional assessment of interoceptive awareness. This is Wolf-Mealing's measure. So that's the piece that I would say, they're anxious and they know it, and they can, as the song goes, you can clap your hands because you're going to benefit from mindfulness, or at least this unwinding anxiety.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
Sure.
I think another question that has come up, and honestly, this hits close to home for me as somebody who works predominantly with youth and really supporting them. I'm curious, how are y'all translating, the findings, the solutions y'all have brought forward to not just adolescents, but even potentially pre-adolescents and just thinking proactively about really how to set them up for success in this crazy world?
Yeah, it's a great question. So here we've designed the apps to work for adolescents as well as adults. So when I wrote the modules for them, I made sure that they included examples of like school or work, this type of thing. So we've tested them with adolescents to make sure that that was the case. Most of my work is with adults, so I haven't done this. Well, I should say in collaboration with Lori Piebert at UMass, we did a study, for example, with adolescent smokers and found that the Craving to Quit app, and this has been published, Craving to Quit app is more effective, I think, whatever the National Cancer Institute piece was. So they not only will use these things, but they like them, they're engaged with them. We haven't done any formal studies with adolescents with the Unwinding Anxiety app, though we've had people use it. And again, we designed it specifically to be adolescent friendly. Some might argue that adolescents are more friendly toward their technology than adults are. So it'd be interesting to see somebody do that actual study with adolescents. With children, I have not done any work there, and it's not my lane. So one thing I would say is I think children are naturally curious. So we, as adults, we could probably learn a lot from them, and then help to get out of the way so we don't, squash their curiosity as they go through the formal education system, which I think kind of forces people to do things as compared to lets them follow their natural curiosity. So again, I'm really talking baseless speculation, a bunch of BS. But here I would say, kids probably know a lot about how to be curious, and we should just help them stay curious.
Absolutely. I love that. Harnessing curiosity for many benefits. That's great. Well, just a quick follow-up question, even to the data you shared, the brand new data. Is this something that was performed, this trial, during the pandemic?
These were data that we had just finished collecting data, I think in 2021 now, in 2019. So it was just pre-pandemic, fortunately, for us to be able to get it. But as one could surmise, digital therapeutics are exploding in popularity because of needing to deliver things at a distance. So I think the digital therapeutic field has had a real, I'm going to call it adolescence, in the sense that people can say, oh, this has the potential to be, something really, whatever the analogy would be, productive or helpful in society or whatever. Yet I say adolescence because the vast majority of digital therapeutics have no evidence behind them and aren't mechanistically based, aren't developed, even in collaboration with clinicians. So folks have to be really, really careful about the field itself and really focus on, ones that have evidence, that have, theoretical mechanism, all these things that we would expect as researcher. It's very different. People can build beautiful apps very quickly if they've got a bunch of money, but that's very different than knowing what to build. So I would just say caveat emptor, buyer beware there.
Okay, great. So, we've had a couple of questions, if you might be willing to address. We're learning a lot more about the gut microbiome, right? And significant impact on our brain and vice versa. How significant a factor do you think this is with respect to anxiety and depression, or kind of your approach in general?
That's a great question. I have no idea. I like the gut microbiome. I've not looked into the literature. I try to eat healthy myself, and I know that what I eat affects my mood. So that's all I can say. N of one is probably important, but I ask a gut microbiome expert that question. It's a good one. I have no idea.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we did have somebody ask, do you think that mindfulness, works when the person is in extreme stress and can't focus at all? Or is there a stage where mindfulness work, is there a stage where mindfulness work may or may not work?
Yes, so I would say it depends. So we found that people with full-blown panic disorder who've had it for a long, like my patient, for example, who've had panic disorder for a long time can benefit from these things. Yet they don't start by trying to throw this in, when they're in the middle of a panic attack. It's like, having a raging forest fire and having a bucket of water. Water puts out fire, but not a forest fire. So here we start by having people practice, okay, here's a tiny bit of anxiety. Here's your bucket of water, learn how to use it, eventually. And then eventually, I don't know what I'm going to lose the analogy, but the idea would be they start to realize that they have a fireproof suit. and that they don't actually have to put out the fire. They can be with anxiety and not get caught up in it. So they can work with full-blown panic attacks and not be subsumed by them. But it's not like, here, sprinkle some mindfulness on and magically you won't have a panic attack. That's not how it works. It's really about helping us learn to work with our minds. And the more we can work with them, the more we'll be able to work with ever increasing amounts of anxiety. So as you saw from those studies, these are people with severe anxiety, our cluster A were folks that all had at least severe anxiety, like the highest level on the GAD-7, and they got down to minimal anxiety. But it doesn't just happen overnight.
Okay, thank you. And I think I'll work at one last question here that's come up. How long lasting is this approach to training, especially for individuals who do practice mindfulness or use meditation to handle their issues and maybe experience some brain impact down the road? Have you looked at some of those kind of long lasting effects or sort of resilience building?
Yeah, so we're now trying to get funding for like 12-month follow-up studies for these things, so we can measure that with our own programs. What I would say with MBSR, I think it's been studied out at like 2 years, 4 years, and there are still lasting effects in some categories. I don't remember the details. So I would say, but that's on a population level. I would say, I had a medical school professor who used to say that statistics are good for populations, but not for individuals. And so here individually, I would say, as people continue to learn mindfulness skills and build them, I would guess that they'll see lasting benefits. And I would also suggest that the more we tap into curiosity and kindness as rewards and see how rewarding they will actually build naturally without us having to try to force ourselves to keep going. If we feel like any of this practice is forced, we're doomed because we've missed the whole point of it. It's really about being curious. It's about being kind and seeing the results, right? This is reward-based learning. Oh, it feels better to be kind to myself than beating myself up. Oh, it feels better to be curious than caught up in worry. And the more we do that, the more we'll tap into the juice of that. And the more that will just keep us not only going, but I would guess helping us deepen our, our understandings of our minds and then being able to work with our own minds.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I think that's a great place to wrap up. So appreciate you, Dr. Brewer, for sharing this information with us again. And I would encourage everybody, definitely check out the resources that he shared. Again, his latest book, Unwinding Anxiety, also has an app by the same name. Encourage you to check that out. And, here in the last couple of minutes too, I promised if you stick around to the end, we'll tell you a little bit more about the opportunity to participate here in our Brain Health Project. So just a quick note on that as we wrap up. Really, what we've discovered is that the power of research truly lies in how we use it to make the world a better place. So we've just launched this large-scale landmark study called the Brain Health Project. And it's designed to help people everywhere be active about maintaining and improving their brain's health and performance. So it's something that you can access no matter where you live. So if you're interested in learning more about the Brain Health Project and possibly participating in it, please check out the website, brainhealthproject.org. You can scan the QR code to go to the website. And also a note for those of you who are viewing and who are interested in maybe getting CEU, continuing education credit from these talks, we also have a website. Please visit ours at centerforbrainhealth.org/CEU. And to everybody, I hope that you are all able to join us for our next Frontiers talk, which is on April 2nd, next Friday. And it's with Dr. Vince Calhoun of Georgia State University. Going to be another great talk. And we so appreciate you all being here today. Thank you so much.
We work. We live, we innovate, and create. At the center of it all is your brain health. The ability to solve problems, think analytically, share empathy, and thrive.
We're trying to make brain performance really the next fitness revolution.
So how do you boost brain power? Welcome to the Brain Health Project, an urgent call to transform your mind to work stronger and faster.
This is an absolute crisis, as great as any we have ever faced. We have to equip the minds and brains of our citizens to cope with the accelerating, dizzying rate of change that they face in their lives.
Your brain health is not fixed. Scientific discoveries prove it can adapt and grow regardless of your starting point.
Our greatest value, the asset that will help us to change everything, every problem we're in, is all in our head.
To harness that treasure, we must measure and monitor progress while things are going well versus waiting for an injury or disease to strike.
Too many of us are outliving our brains, and that does not have to be the case.
The information age is bombarding us with more content than our human brains can handle. How do you keep from getting lost in this? And focus on deep thinking. For starters, stop multitasking.
Science shows us that multitasking is bad for your brain. It reduces fluid intelligence, causes brain atrophy, and increases chronic stress.
The global pandemic is creating more stress than ever, stress that leads to depression and anxiety and beyond. Unlocking our potential to navigate these hurdles starts with learning the right strategies, even in school.
So when teachers have these strategies, they're empowered to support our learners, and then the learners are now able to take ownership of their learning.
Training kids how to think is doubling academic achievement among middle schoolers.
I think the greatest national security threat is pre-K through 12. If we don't take care of educating our young men and women, then we have to ask ourselves, where are we going to be in 20 years?
Our world-renowned scientists know you can increase your brain health, not lose it. It's time for a new category of health, brain health. You are a game changer. Ready to transform the world with us? Be a part of the brain health revolution. It starts here.